He could preach a sermon and never use a single word. I've been learning all my life about living and loving like Jesus Christ, who He was and what He did, and letting that change the way I live. I didn't know then, but I know now. Looking back, I'm so thankful how He gave me this family for one reason. Learning to be living and loving like Jesus. Mama read stories of the saints of old, and she put my feet on the road to go, singing Amazing Grace, quoting John 3:16. Daddy's quiet voice still steers me right. The way He served was a shining light. Lord, I'm praying they rub off on me. Yeah. I've been learning all my life about living and loving like Jesus Christ, who He was and what He did, and letting that change the way I live. I didn't know then, but I know now. Looking back, I'm so thankful how He gave me this family for one reason. Learning to be living and loving like Jesus. No, I ain't perfect here in this old life. Every day I'm trying so hard to get it right. But I'm thankful for mama and daddy, a sister and brother, all of the others who's cheering me on. Yeah, they're keeping me strong. I've been learning all my life about living and loving like Jesus Christ, who He was and what He did, letting that change the way I live. I didn't know then, but I know now. Looking back, I'm so thankful how He gave me this family for one reason. He gave me this family for one reason. Learning to be living and loving like Jesus. Yeah, I'm learning to be living and loving just like Jesus.
The Melodiers. Learning, living, loving.
There's nothing quite so dear to me as old time four-part harmony from those yellow hymnal pages.
Songs about the Rock of Ages.
I've sung of sweetness by and by in that bright land beyond the sky. But these days I can hardly wait to stroll on through those pearly gates. There's gonna be singing over yonder that will make the angels wonder if they ever really knew how to sing. When they hear the saints together sing a song that they can never sing because it is the melody of the redeemed. Then the host of heaven will join with the forgiven, worshiping the King of Kings. So if you got a reservation, want a joyous celebration, you'll be singing over yonder with me. I can almost hear that angel band marching right through glory land with the ones who've gone before us,
Now a part of heaven's chorus.
they're playing all my favorite songs. I can't wait to sing along, so I'll rehearse while here below until it's time for me to go. There's gonna be singing over yonder that will make the angels wonder if they ever really knew how to sing. When they hear the saints together sing a song that they can never sing because it is the melody of the redeemed. Then the host of heaven will join with the forgiven, worshiping the King of Kings. So if you got a reservation, want a joyous celebration, you'll be singing over yonder with me. Singing over yonder, singing over yonder, singing over yonder, singing over yonder. There's gonna be singing over yonder that will make the angels wonder if they ever really knew how to sing. When they hear the saints together sing a song that they can never sing, because it is the melody of the redeemed. Live the host of heaven will join without beginning, worshiping the King of Kings. So if you got a reservation for the joyous celebration, come on, sing, sing, sing. Over yonder with me. Do the singing, sing over yonder. Over yonder with me.
Ernie Haas and Signature Sound, singing over yonder.
The hurt is great, you just can't take it anymore. But you have a friend who's already been there before. So when your hopes and dreams are shattered by your failures, you can rise above it all. Look to the risen Savior. Reach for His perfect grace. Reach for the peace that waits when you need to be held close. He's never far away. You can find healing inside His ever-loving arms. Get on your knees and reach for the stars. To look at me, you might think I'm standing strong. You don't understand how weak I am on my own. 'Cause when I fought the past alone, my heart grew colder. But when I surrendered, all the weight was lifted off my shoulders. Reach for His perfect grace. Reach for the peace that waits when you need to be held close. He's never far away. You can find healing inside His ever-loving arms. Get on your knees and reach for the stars. You can find healing inside His ever-loving arms. Get on your knees and reach for the stars.
Smith, White, and Fairchild. Reach for the scars.
You're listening to Affirm Southern Gospel Radio. Get Macy's lowest prices of the season on incredible specials you need for summer. Like 50 to 70% off designer suits for him, 75% off gold and silver chains, and 65% off luggage from Samsonite, Travel Pro, Delsey, and more. Plus, get your online order even faster with free curbside pickup or pickup in store at Macy's. Savings off sale.
Like to say good morning. Nice day out there, isn't it? Before we get started, does anyone have any spoken prayer requests this morning?
I'd like to get prayed for a friend of mine. He told me that this had y'all to pray for her. He told me to say a friend.
Okay. Any others this morning? Okay.
Also, remember all the little girls, they've all had ear infections, all this stomach stuff that's going around, so they really need prayer.
Remember my cousin, his name's William Kincaid, and he has MRSA, but they're trying to do a heart surgery on him, it's about that. So they finally got the MRSA under control, so we don't know the day yet that we'll operate, but remember him.
Okay, Steve. Ruby?
Remember me and my family, I've only got a day to have surgery before the end of June.
Tim, we still have unsafe voting.
Oh, remember me too, I went last week, to get labs, they've done blood work. I got an appointment coming up, Dr. Payne, on 13th this month, and I've been seeing her once a year, and they said last time I went, I got a good PSA level, but they wanted to keep checking on it, because the time before last, they said it was really elevated, and they said they might want to do a biopsy with that. And so I just pray that my labs come back good and I get a good report on the 13th.
Okay. Ronnie?
Remember me and my family, remember my two brothers, remember Wild Hand Shooter, Tom Bromley, Ray Hicks, and continue to remember Taylor and Pam, and continue to remember Debbie's family.
Any others?
Remember Kathleen, she's not
Okay.
going around. I think she keeps having a little mini stroke. And she had two just in the last couple of, it's like in the last 2 days. And then my other sister was,
Y'all probably seen our great nephew, Jesse Schneider. Remember him? Betty communicated with the boy's mother just shortly and a little while ago, and he's going in for some surgery and some skin grafts. Just remember that situation. He's in a burn center in Georgia. Any others?
There's a gentleman named Pat Wood, they diagnosed him with brain cancer, and then it moved into his body, now he's just got stage 4 cancer. And they pretty much wrote him off. The power of God is able to do anything.
Yeah.
Keep him in mind and his family and stuff, just go back home.
sitting around all in the forest, and I said, the young guys got killed over the police.
Yeah.
Just sad.
Any others? Just be mindful of our time together, our fellowship, our worship time here, and the services afterwards. Just ask for His Spirit to dwell with us for a few hours, right? And just be in communion with Him. Ask you to stand. Mason, if you'd lead us out, please. we're in a new quarter now. Moved into the summer quarter. We're in Exodus, and today's lesson, we jump around. We start out with Exodus 1 for a few verses. We jump Exodus 2, and then we're back. Then we go to Exodus 3. But when we think about Exodus, the word Exodus means to go out, to exit. It's a book that chronicles God's people leaving the bondage they were under in Egypt. So what's going on from Genesis to where we are now? I think it's important to kind of set things up here before we just jump into it. But some 400 years have passed since Joseph and his family moved into Egypt. It was originally around 70 people from that remnant of Israel, Joseph's family, that went into Egypt. Now, here in 400 years later, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, where we're at today, those 70 people have grown to about 2 million. Quite a population boom there. And when you think about the 400 years of silence, if you will, there's no mention in our word of that 400 years much. There's nothing chronicled there. It seems like that there's no mention of God. But all those years that they were under this oppression in Egypt, I'm sure that God seemed to be nowhere. That's probably their mindset at the time, while in captivity, while under that oppression in Egypt. But that's about to come to an end. We're going to see that in the book of Exodus. The main theme in Exodus might be, as the title implies, exiting Egypt. But I also think that it's hugely important that this book also reveals God's presence. God proves that while things do seem to be bleak, He's still in control. And when I look at and by the way, I want y'all, I'm not an expert on Scripture. I read these things and I share with you what I get from it, and I always ask you guys for your input. So I learn something every time I study for one of these. Trust me. And I just try to share. That's my role. I just try to share what I picked up. But sometimes I learn from you guys too, and that's really neat when we can work through that like that. God reveals His presence, His power in this book. 400 years He's been kind of non-existent, at least in the people's eyes, but there was a reason for that, and we'll see that. We see that in Exodus. He will deliver them. He will send them a leader. Today's lesson, and you all have heard Mark talk about it before, sometimes I don't understand where they get the title for some of these lessons. This lesson's titled Leadership, but there's nothing in here about leadership. However, at the end of our lesson, He will call on that one that will be the leader. And that is, as we see, that will be Moses. But anyway, so what's in Exodus? What will we learn in this quarter, in this book, that's absolutely vital and still relevant today? I always look at these lessons from the Old Testament and try to, see what's there that's for us, to lean on, to be, to grow from. And it is these items. God's power sometimes not only is witnessed by His people, but the world as well. That happens. That happens today. It happened in Exodus, and it still happens today. God is a deliverer, and He has no limitations. Okay? Also, the book of Exodus reminds us that God expects obedience from His people. Exodus touches on that. And absolutely, this is true today. God chooses certain individuals and certain groups of people for specific works, don't he? To achieve certain things. We'll see that in Exodus. So, anyway, just kind of wanted to kind of set things up before we start reading. It's on page 1 in your quarterly. It starts out Exodus chapter 1. Like I said, we were going to move over into chapter 3 for a handful of verses as well. But we'll start out here in verse 7 of Exodus 1. I'll read, you guys read after me. It says, "And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them.
There arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph.
And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we.
Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it came to pass that when there multiplied mouths who war enemies and fight against us, and they get them out of the land.
Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses.
But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew and grieved because of the children of Israel.
And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor.
And they made their lives better with hard bondage, warfare, brick, and all manner of service in the field. All their services wherein they made them serve was the rigor.
And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrow.
And I came down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land into the good land, and enlarge into a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Hivites and the Jebusites.
Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppressed them.
Come now, therefore, I will send thee into Pharaoh, and that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt.
Amen. Amen. Okay, so we started out, as you've seen there, with verse 7 of chapter 1. We skipped 6 verses. What did we skip? What's those first 6 verses that we skipped? They connect the latter part of Genesis with the book of Exodus. They mention the names of the people in Joseph's family that came into Egypt. Remember, Joseph was already in Egypt, and his family came afterwards. So all of Jacob's sons and their wives, they've come into Egypt. Their brother Joseph was already there. Can someone tell me why Joseph was there? It's a separate lesson, but I really want to quickly, can you tell me why Joseph was there, and why was Joseph so popular in Egypt? Sold into slavery. Did he not also save the Egyptians people when he predicted the famine? Yeah, and he had a plan for them as far as how to grow their crops and preserve and put things away. And yes. So he was a hero in the eyes of Egypt. He was very popular.
Was he also the one, his father or his dad made him a coat of many colors?
That's him. That was him, yes. So I don't want to get too far into Joseph, but we have to know why Joseph was an important figure to the Egyptians, okay? And that's important. So 3.5 centuries have passed since Joseph and brought his family into Egypt, and now we jump to verse 7 where we started. I mentioned earlier there was this bleak time in God's people's history where there's really no connection with God here, it seems. There was, while they were under this oppression in Egypt. But God was at work. We have to remember that. God was at work. Look at how they multiplied. Those years in Egypt probably seemed like a delay to the people. They're probably wondering, where are you at, God? But he was at work. it was necessary, that time was necessary for this population to build up, to get to this number where now it is, where it's finally at. So that had to be, we had to have those 2 million to get to the number God needed to advance his nation. So that's what we mentioned. They touch on that in verse 7. It says that they were exceedingly mighty and the land was filled with them, right? So in verse 8, we see that the new king has come on board in the Egyptian government. And it says in verse 8, and he knew not Joseph. So this new king never knew of Joseph, is what we hear. The hero that some centuries back saved his own nation, this new king doesn't even know who he is. He feels no indebtedness to Joseph's descendants, right? Either he was totally ignorant or he just didn't care about the history, about what God had done, Joseph's God done through Joseph to save his people. It says he knew not Joseph. When I read that, I wondered one of 2 things. Did he not know because he was not taught? Or did he know and just didn't care? It doesn't really say. So when I thought about that, let's look at those 2 possibilities. Do we have a responsibility to teach the generation behind us the history of our people and what God did for our people?
Yes, he instructs us to.
Exactly. See, this new leader, if he was taught that, he disregarded his teaching, didn't he? It didn't mean anything to him. So I thought about that. Was he taught correctly? Was he brought up? Or had he been taught all that, but it didn't mean nothing to him? He had a different stance. He wasn't a believer. He had his own focus, I guess, if you will. He was coming in from more of a liberal, I don't want to get into politics, but if that was the case, the old traditions didn't mean nothing to him. He had a different view of how to lead the country. Don't we see that today in our leadership? Any comments so far? But he does see in verse 9, he does see this much. He sees a people that are growing so much that now it's becoming a problem. He says in verse 9, and he said unto his people, behold, the people of children of Israel are more and mightier than we are. So there's prejudice here, okay? The Egyptians back in the day, they thought that they were the ultimate, people. They had this proud sense of superiority over others, obviously, over other people. But you can see they're getting a little concerned now because the Israelites have grown such a mighty number. And then in verse 10, he says, come on, let's deal wisely with them. Well, wisely in his eyes is not God's way, exactly, for sure. But he says, let's deal wisely with them, lest they multiply to come to pass, that when there falleth out any war, they join also our enemies and fight against us. So you can see what he's thinking. They had enemies in other countries around them, okay? Namely, I found that the Hittites is somebody we read about before. The Egyptians were a little concerned about them. They were enemies, and what if this 2 million population of Israelites would want to join up with the Hittites? They could take over Egypt for sure. So you can see this young king, this new king, he's concerned about that being a possibility. He mentions it there. He said they could join forces with our enemies. Verse 11, we find out, how are they going to deal with these people? We're going to really work them. We're going to work them in the ground, It says, therefore they set them over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. That was in verse 11. So they were forced to do hard labor. They constructed 2 cities, Pithom and Ramses. And just a side note on how Egyptians continued to persecute the Israelites. When they were building these cities, they used to provide them straw for building their bricks. Well, later on, in continuing his putting burdens on the people, Pharaoh quit providing the straw for them. Remember that story? And they had to go find their own straw to make their bricks. He was trying to just make it even harder for them. And I thought about the pyramids and the Sphinx and those things. Those were already built prior to this, from what I gather in my research. But they did build these 2 cities that's mentioned. So you can see what's happening here. Let's make these people that are under our control. We'll make them do this hard work. We'll afflict them. But look what happens in verse 12. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied. See God at work here? And grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. That's in verse 12. So notice God's handiwork right there. The more that they're afflicted, the stronger they get. So it's actually, it's working in reverse than what Pharaoh had in mind, right? I guess he thought he could wear them down by giving them all this work, but they actually grew in numbers, it says. So notice how God is building up this nation. He's building his people up. I thought that was really interesting, how this was all part of God's plan. Building the people up was part of God's plan. Nothing will get in the way of God's plans, will it? No. And there's some prophecy back in Genesis that where some of these things were mentioned. For example, I think it's worth noting this, that back in chapter 15 of Genesis, God told Abraham that Israel will have times of hardship in Egypt. He told Abraham, "Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and they shall serve them and be afflicted 400 years." God told Abraham about this very thing we just read here now in Exodus. Because by the time we get to the Exodus, where we're at now in this today's reading, 4 predictions from back in Genesis 15 have already happened. Israel was strangers in Egypt. They were, like God said. They did serve them. They were afflicted, and the 400 years. Everything lines up. So God had this in his plan all along. So I thought about that. And should we be encouraged when we read through the history of God's people how he said it and it happened? Yes. We should, shouldn't we? Absolutely. We should be joyous that. And the unbeliever or the world should be concerned about God's truths, right? Yeah. There's still some unfulfilled prophecy that we have to look forward to, right? So, I don't know. Anybody got a thought on that? I was just kind of rambling here, but...
Tim, I just think, this moment in time where they're in captivity in Egypt, it seems like in the Old Testament that is already referred back to as that time when God delivered them from there. And it was probably I would say, one of the most times that they were afflicted in the lowest part of their lives, I guess you could say. But a deliverance was coming, and it was reflected all through the Old Testament there. They always referred to God bringing them out of the land of Egypt.
Verses 13 and 14, they just continue to pour it on. More, they use the word rigor. It says, verse 13, the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. 14, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. So when I look, we take verses 13 and 14 for a second and just look at them. God's purpose was to, when you look at God's eternal plan, his intention was to bless Israel, okay? And no amount of affliction that Pharaoh could put on was going to block that from happening. You see that? This cruel slavery did not work. Eventually, the people grew stronger, right? And we see as we go further into Exodus, the people were ready to leave, and they will leave, and that's other lessons that's coming up. This is just the beginning of it. They tried their best to stop it, but the cruel slavery didn't work. You got to think that the people at this period, and John just touched on, this was their lowest point. They had to feel hopeless, in a sense. They had no idea that the bigger picture that God was working out for them, you know. At this time, they really don't see that. I also thought about Satan knowing that the Savior is coming from this line of people. You know, he tried his best too, didn't he, to keep to squelch God's people, to end, you know, obviously, because he knew the Savior was coming through that line, that lineage. So when I thought about the idea of the people suffering so long, but God is still in control. He has a greater plan. That's another takeaway that for us today, I think we need to be mindful of. Is this very same God on the throne today? He is, isn't he? Sure he is. Are we in perilous times right now? We are. We may not understand it, why we have to go through some of the things we go through. We may not understand why certain things are happening in our world. But he has the grand plan, right? He's in control. You know, just like the children of Israel at this time, they didn't see that either. They were just under this oppression, but deliverance was coming. And we have to know that too. Deliverance is coming for us, right? Any thoughts so far? No one's snoring yet, so that's good.
Jim, I was thinking, a lot of things maybe happen today is where the majority of people have turned their back on God. And I don't know, it's just, we can see it each day we live, that things are getting just a little worse. And the people are just pushing God out the door and just going and doing their thing. God's not happy with that, and he will not put up with that.
Yeah.
It's like what happened here when he finally got the Israelites out of Egypt. Egypt is a big country.
Mm-hmm.
And they controlled a lot of territory and had a big army too.
Yeah. The people who put together our literature for us, that we've kind of followed their outline, they skip the remainder of chapter 1 in our text. They skip all of chapter 2 and 6 verses of chapter 3, and then we pick up from there. So, but I think we have to real quick, and I've just got some short notes here on that. What have we missed? What did we skip? Well, what's happened? Moses is born. Pharaoh has declared that all male Hebrew children are to be killed. This is now another step in that population control, okay? But we know what happened with Moses. Remember, his mother hid him in the reeds and the bulrushes, and Pharaoh's daughter found him and raises him as her own in royalty. Moses murders one of the slave drivers that's beating on one of the Hebrew people. Pharaoh wants to kill him. He's coming after him. Moses flees to Midian, where he gets married. He has 2 sons, and he will be there 40 years before he's called to as the great deliverer or the leader of God's people, and through the burning bush. Okay, so that was, man, we went through a lot of time right there, but they skipped it, but I think we just needed to kind of connect the dots, you know what I mean, and mention that. So when our text takes back up, Moses is at the burning bush, okay, and God is talking to him through that event. God is speaking directly to him through the burning bush, and that again is a fulfillment of a prophecy. Back in Genesis 50, on his deathbed, Joseph made an oath to the children of Israel. He said, God will surely visit you. Here he is. Through Moses, God himself, through the burning bush, is now visiting with Moses and talking to Moses. And that's where we start back up. In verse 7 of chapter 3, and the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of the land unto a good land, with a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. It's a lot of ites, isn't it? Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now therefore, I will send thee, he's talking to Moses directly, unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people and the children of Israel out of Egypt. So the Lord tells Moses here, where our text ends, that he has seen the affliction of his people, of Israel. He has heard their cries. He's now ready to move them out of Egypt. Out of Egypt into Canaan. Remember, that was the land originally promised to Abraham. He says it's a good land. The land originally promised Abraham. It was a fruitful land, flowing with milk and honey. However, it's occupied by all these people we just mentioned, Hivites and all those. So those will eventually be overthrown. You know, that's the plan moving forward. In verse 10, Moses will be the one sent. God tells him he will go to Pharaoh and demand the release of his people. So, and that's where our text ends. There's several takeaways. There wasn't a lot of text here, but there's a lot of thought, and I want you guys to share with me what any thoughts you have on this. But I thought about the new king that took over, that knew nothing about the history of Joseph. I thought about that. How important is us as parents, as educators, or whatever your role is, teaching the generation behind us the history of our people, the accurate history. There's so much of this people wanting to throw out certain parts of our history. How important is history? And how important is God, the work that God did through people in our history? See, the new king that took over, it says he knew not Joseph. So it's very important, isn't it, that the ones coming up behind us know about God, know God's ways, and know of the leaders that have relied on God in the past. We need more of that, don't we? Another thought. We just read a couple of them here. There's more proof of God fulfilling promises. Okay, that's in this lesson too. We need to be mindful of that. Any thoughts? Anybody got anything to add?
I just thought it was amazing how that he tried to destroy them through the work that he put upon them and all that, and the males still kept producing and so forth. Could he not sense or see handiwork of God, do that, and at least stop and think, I cannot take this person or this God to task because he's
Yeah.
greater than I am.
Yeah.
It's just, and I guess that's the way we all are. Of the flesh, we think we can handle things that we can't, instead of giving it to God and going along with what he has for us to do.
I was having some thoughts, talking about leadership and stuff. I recall something my dad said years ago. My dad said we all need to stand behind our president and back him. And there's so many people today, I just hear them fussing and saying such things about our president and our government. And then I hear how these people are starving to death over natural little baby stuff starving. And I think we ought to all, everybody in America ought to all get down on their knees and thank God and support our country and our government.
That's right. We should. I think also when we think about God's people and how he looked after them through such perilous times, he was still had their best interest. He still had an outcome that he was working towards on their behalf. It should assure us today that we still we live under that same umbrella, don't we, of his protection, of his plan, right? He will deliver us. He will deliver us. He will either deliver us from death or he'll deliver us through death, right? Either way, we're delivered. His grace is always sufficient.
Yeah. Tim, to kind of go along with what Sister Donna was saying there, generally speaking, people can be pretty dumb.
Yeah.
And when I say people, I mean, we fall into that because, God puts things very plainly out before us.
Yeah.
And we don't see it.
No.
Which, back in your introduction, because again, I think this lesson is very challenging, but it's laying the foundation for, the whole quarter. But, back in the beginning, you asked a question, I forget exactly how you phrased it, but, about what our thoughts were about Exodus. And I'm sitting back here been chewing on it, whether I should have said what I was thinking or not. But, throughout the book of Exodus, and again, it reminds me of today's time, quit whining and obey God.
Yeah, sure. Good advice there, for sure.
Because we're going to see a lot of that through the book. We're going to see a lot of whining and a lot of disobeying God.
Yeah. I saw also about the burning bush. As a general rule, God does not speak to us through a burning bush, does he? It says he speaks to us through a still small voice, though, right? Are we tuned in? Are we having difficulty hearing because there's too much noise? Thought about that. Is there other things creating static? We don't have a good signal there to hear that still small voice. Is the signal weak? Yeah, and also the title of the lesson, even though we don't really touch on leadership much at all, but it is entitled Leadership. I thought about leadership. What would this nation be if we had godly leaders that search for God's will in their decision making and guidance in their decision making? Wouldn't that be awesome?
Most of our founding fathers did do that.
Yes, they did. They did. And then my last takeaway here real quick, and I was trying to find things that are relevant for us in these lessons, and here's one. There's a picture of redemption in this lesson, okay? In verses 7 and 8, God told Moses, I have seen their affliction. I will deliver them unto a good land flowing with milk and honey. So when you think about that, when God redeems us, He don't just redeem us from something. He redeems us into or onto something as well. We are saved from sin, but unto holiness, unto heaven, right? Paul touched on this in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5 and 6. When we were dead in sins, He quickened us together with Christ, and hath raised us together, and made us sit together in heavenly places in Christ Jesus. We have been brought out of death unto life. God said in our lesson today, I'm taking the children out of bondage and into a good land. Is that a picture of redemption? It is, isn't it? That's salvation. That's redemption. Anybody got anything else to add?
Well, I don't know, I just had thoughts, you know, I thought this year's something that Dad once said, you know, you need to back up it. I gotta think, we've also, people in government today is not like people in government back then, that might also have something to do with it, you know. Yeah, ones we got today not like the ones years ago.
No, that's for sure. All right. Thank you.